Bryan, B-R-Y-A-N, Johnston, Johnston.
And you are the author of
Deep
what's
in the Woods, the 1935 kidnapping of 9-year-old George Weyerhaeuser, heir to America's mightiest timber dynasty. A long title.
well, yeah, no, I love it. Hey, Brian, I've just done a brief overview of kind of the probably scratching the surface of this. You have thousands of pages of documents that you've combed through. Uh, First off, give us give us your elevator speech of what this whole kidnapping is about. If you had to sum up this kidnapping, because there's a lot of twists and turns to it, it's hard to summarize it, but give us your best elevator pitch on what this kidnapping is all about and what happened.
Well, in 1935, in May of 1935, 9-year-old George Weyerhaeuser is walking home from school, and he's snatched right off the street, about 3 blocks from his house. And the kidnappers, there were 3 of them, who I should say 2.5, because the female participant really didn't have much to do with it. She just kind of went along with it because she was a 19-year-old Mormon girl, and as for her faith, did everything her husband told her to do. So George is kidnapped. Their family is quite wealthy. The Weyerhaeuser family owns more timber than you can possibly imagine. Check this out. The Weyerhaeuser Corporation family owns approximately 4% of the entire state of Washington.
Wow.
Mm-hmm.
Stay.
George's great-grandfather is still to this day considered the 12th richest man in American history, Bill Gates being number 11. So yeah, they were ripe for the picking, as they might say. Back in the 30s, kidnapping was becoming really, really popular with the criminal set. And so rich families had to be concerned about something like this. This is not a short version, I know, I understand. I apologize. It's hard to sum this up, but I'll see if I can. So George is walking home from school, and he's snatched off the street by these 3 kidnappers. And so then the kidnappers kept George, they kept him buried in a hole in the ground out in the forests of Issaquah, chained up in there. And they kept him there for a couple of nights. Then they loaded him, stuck him in the trunk of a car, drove him back to Spokane, and then on the way there, they kept him chained to a tree. They got him there at the house in Spokane, and they kept him locked in a closet for 5 days until the kidnappers finally got the money that they requested, which was $200,000 in small unmarked bills. Let me give you a sense of how much money that is. Today, that'd be almost $4 million. Back in 1935, during the Depression, the average income for a person was $1,500 a year. So the kidnappers were asking the equivalent of 133 years of annual salary for the average person. Huge amount of money, huge amount of money. In fact, when the Lindbergh baby was kidnapped 2 years earlier, the kidnappers initially only asked for $50,000. So this was 4 times what the Lindbergh baby kidnappers asked for. So kidnappers take George, they send the ransom note, and the first demand was $200,000 in small unmarked bills. And they told the family would communicate with the kidnappers using personal ads in the Seattle Post-Intelligencer newspaper. And they would use a code name, Percy Minnie, so that when the Weyerhaeusers were ready to pay the ransom, they would post a personal ad saying, "We're ready to pay, signed Percy Minnie." And so the kidnappers every day would open up the Seattle PI, and they would look for a personal ad with the name Percy Minnie, so that they know, okay, the family's ready to talk. Then the kidnappers set up this elaborate plan for the money drop. This plays out like a film noir movie. It's just amazing. I couldn't make half the stuff up. So they told they told the Weyerhaeusers, okay, here's how you're going to drop the money. Okay. You are going to go to this location, this house kind of halfway between Seattle and Tacoma, an old abandoned house. And you're going to look for a little stick in the ground with a piece of white fabric attached to it, almost like a little flag. And under that, there'll be a tin can. And inside the tin can, there will be a note telling you where to go for the next note. And so George's dad at night drives out to this location, finds the abandoned house, finds the little flag, finds the tin can, finds a note, says drive 700 yards to the next location, goes to that one, finds another flag, but there's no tin can and there's no note. He's like, oh my God, I have to make the drop tonight, or who knows what's going to happen to my son. He's crawling around on his hands and knees with matches trying to find it. Can't find it. He's freaked out, drives back to town. The next day, the kidnappers call him and say, hey, what gives? Where's our money? He's like, I tried, but there wasn't any note. And they went, okay, we're going to give you one more chance. And so he went through the whole process again. This time, there were the notes that led him to the final drop location. Leaves the money in the car, walks down the road. Kidnappers jump out of the bushes, jump in the car. Off they go. They get their 200,000 bucks. So then the kidnappers, they got what they wanted. So they were going to bring George back to Seattle and drop him off. But on the way back, they were like, where should we drop him off? It really never crossed their mind that they would get this far. And so they decided to drop him off out in the forest, basically right close to where they had him buried in the ground. And so they dropped him off on this old timber road in Issaquah with a blanket and $1 and said, okay, George's, your dad's going to come pick you up. And off they went. Except George's dad isn't coming to find him because George's dad doesn't know that he's been released. And so George is standing out there in the rain in pitch dark in the forest. He's 9 years old. No one's coming for him. After a couple hours, he goes, okay, this is stupid. I've had enough. So he starts walking. He walks for miles. And he comes to this farmer's house and knocks on the door at like 6 in the morning. Farmer answers the door. And there's this little kid standing on the front porch, all wet. He says, hi, I'm George Weyerhaeuser. Can you take me to my parents' house? The kid who's been on the front page of every newspaper in America just magically appears on the front porch of this farmer's house out in Issaquah. They load the kid in the car and they drive off, and some really interesting things happen between Issaquah and Tacoma, but I don't want to give away too much because that's such an amazing thing that happens on the way there. But eventually got home, family goes crazy, the press goes crazy. Just to give you a sense of how big of a story this was, the Weyerhaeuser home in Tacoma became pretty much the biggest tourist attraction in the state of Washington. There would be cars lined up down the street to slowly drive by the house to see the Weyerhaeuser house. And people would run up and they would steal flowers out of their yard as souvenirs. And there were reporters just camped out in their yard for the entire week. It was amazing. It was absolutely amazing. And then there was police and FBI agents staked out all the time here. This was, at the time, probably the greatest crime in Washington state history. And even today, it's got to be in the top 5, honestly. And if it's not one of the greatest, it's easily the most fascinating. While I was researching this book, every night I would be running upstairs to my wife saying, you cannot believe what I just learned. It was just golden nugget of information after golden nugget of information. It was just remarkable. These cool little elements that I kept discovering, throughout the story. So after the kidnappers drop off George gets home, then becomes, as the New York Times called it, the greatest manhunt in Northwest history. And the FBI and local authorities are searching high and low to find the kidnappers. And without giving too much away, they captured the two of the kidnappers because of a 20-cent cigarette case. That was their undoing. And they eventually captured the third kidnapper, the mastermind of the kidnapper. And what was interesting about that was they almost had him, like the day after they captured the other two. But the reason he got away was, and again, this is just an interesting little side note, he had made a break for it to Butte, Montana. And he's standing on a street corner in Butte, Montana, the day after the other kidnappers are captured. And he's standing there and he looks across the street and there's a cop. And the cop is staring at him. And then he's staring at the cop. The cop's staring at him. And the cop's like looking at him really peculiarly. And so the kidnapper goes, oh crap, he knows that I'm the kidnapper, and he makes a break for it. Well, the cop didn't recognize him as the kidnapper because he didn't know he was the kidnapper. He recognized him because he'd arrested him 3 years earlier and just happened to recognize him on the street. The guy runs away, the cop chases after him, and the cop would have caught him, except the kidnapper jumped into a yard and there was a guard dog, and the cop had to make a choice: shoot the dog and capture the guy, or not shoot the dog. He decided not to shoot him, and as a result, the kidnapper got away for another year.
Wow.
So again, I know this is really long-winded. I apologize. There's just no way to sum it up shortly, and you'll have lots of questions to follow up. But two of the kidnappers, they go to trial. Harmon Whaley, who was he and his wife, Margaret. Harmon gets 45 years at Alcatraz. Margaret, interestingly, tried to plead guilty, even though she had virtually nothing to do with it. In fact, she never once saw George in person. She only heard him once while they were in the car. And she heard George out of the trunk say, hey, mister, you gonna let me out? And she was like, what? There's a kid in our trunk? And so she tried to plead guilty, and the judge says, what? You're not gonna plead guilty, that's dumb. You went along bit with it, so you're guilty of that, but you didn't actively participate in the kidnapping. And so he said, you're going to plead not guilty and you're going to go to trial. And then it became like this humongous trial in Washington. Humongous trial, really big deal. Well, there's a whole bunch that goes into that as well. But long story short, she got 20 years in a Michigan work farm. And then they finally captured the mastermind, Bill Mahan. And he got 60 years in Alcatraz. And I had an opportunity to actually talk with George 85 years after the fact. And this was the first time he's ever, first of all, this is the first book that's ever been written about this story, which is utterly astonishing, because this is one of the most fascinating stories that I've ever stumbled across in my life. And if I'm wrong about that, then it's the most wrong I've ever been about anything in my life. It's an amazing story. But George was willing to talk with me about it, which blew my mind. And he was engaging, he was funny, he was still pretty sharp. He still remembered an awful lot about it. And he asked me, he goes, Bryan, how long is it going to take you to write this book? And I said, well, probably about 2 years, George. He goes, Bryan, I'm almost 94. Write fast. And George is still around. He's 96 years old right now, and he's still hanging in there. But one of the most fascinating things about this, and you can't tell this in the story because it's the biggest kicker of the story, but I'll tell you anyway, was 25 years after it happened, one of George's kidnappers, Harmon Whaley, he was released from prison early, got paroled, and he called George up. George at the time was in his 30s, and he was a couple of years short of becoming the president of the Weyerhaeuser Corporation. So he was high on the food chain. And his kidnapper called him and said, hey, George, this is Harmon. one of your kidnappers. I just got out of prison. I could sure use a job. And George hired him.
No way.
George hired his kidnapper.
Oh, okay. I won't say that, but that just gave me chills.
And
Oh,
I asked George, I said, how could you do that? I mean, that is amazing. How could you do that?
yeah.
And he says, I think he appreciated it.
Mm.
So
Well, hey, Bryan, that was a lot of information. I don't know
I
how.
know, I apologize. I wish I could pare it down. That's what your editor's going to do.
Well, no, the thing is, like reading the FBI synopsis, it was even more intricate than the details you gave me. You didn't even get into the serial numbers on the money, you know,
Oh, no.
and what happened in Salt Lake. And so there's so much intricacies to this story, but it'll also be just good for people to read the book, because there's so much to it. So I think just like I'll include definitely bits and pieces of that, what we just got there. But then I think as we move on in the interview, I think we should focus on the local Spokane connection, because that'll be really relevant to our viewers. And then
Yep,
I want to ask you why write a book on this, and how did you even get involved with this
sure,
case? So
sure.
let's start there actually. So I want to ask you, what piqued your interest in this case, in this story? Why write a book on this?
Well, I've written a couple of books on Northwest centric stuff, and I was looking for my next piece of material. And so I was just starting to research on basically interesting things that have happened in the state of Washington. And I stumbled across a story about 4 years ago, and I was like, I wasn't even familiar with the Weyerhaeuser kidnapping. And I just kind of filed it away with my, potential projects down the road. And then after about a year and a half, I went back to it and decided to do a little bit more research on it. And the deeper I dug, the more fascinating the story became. And I just kept going, I can't believe there hasn't been a book written about this. This is crazy. I kept doing more research, and I just went, this is absolutely nuts. I have to write a book about this. Because it, like I said, it plays out like a Hollywood movie. There are so many amazing things that happen in this. I couldn't make the stuff up if I tried. That's why I decided to write about it, because it honestly is the most fascinating story I've ever stumbled across.
Wow. So tell us about the Spokane connection. He was kidnapped for, it was 7 days, right?
Mhm.
He was gone for 7 days, and he spent a big majority of his time in Spokane. Talk about what the Spokane connection is to this kidnapping case, and what George did and while he was in Spokane.
Sure. So the kidnappers all started down in Salt Lake City. The husband and wife, George, Harmon, and his wife, Margaret, who's 19 years old. And Harmon ran across an old prison buddy in Salt Lake City. And William Mahan was a smooth talker. And he was like, hey, I'm heading up north to Spokane. You guys should come with me. And they had $6 to their name. And they're like, maybe it'll help us get a job or something. And we went along with them. So they got up to Spokane and they rented a house there. And that was just kind of where they hung out. And then Harmon and Bill Mahan, they all went across the state. And while they were over there, Harmon and Bill started casing banks as potential bank robbers. Excuse me. And so then they get back to Spokane, and this is where everything changed. The calculus totally changed. Margaret's sitting around the house and she's reading the Spokesman Review. And she sees an article about George's grandfather, who had just recently died. And she just read the article out loud. Oh, this is interesting. Rich guy, Weyerhaeuser, just recently died. She says this out loud to her husband and Bill Mahan. She didn't really think anything of it. Bill Mahan, the wheels start turning. He's like, rich family, person dies, maybe maybe the son of the person died gets inheritance. Maybe they've got kids. So he sees the angle. So this whole kidnapping was all spurred by that little article, this obituary in the Spokesman newspaper. And that's what started the whole thing. So then after they went and kidnapped George and they kept him buried in the ground in Issaquah for a couple of days, then they decided to come back to Spokane and they rented a house, they rented the same house again. And that's where they kept George locked up for 5 days, kept him locked in a closet there in Spokane. And what was also interesting was the house that they rented it from a local pastor. So the pastor comes to the house to talk with them. And, she is like, I want you to make sure you water my lawn, you keep it green. And they're like, yes, ma'am, of course, ma'am. Little does she know that 25 feet away, 9-year-old George Weyerhaeuser is locked up in the closet.
Wow. So he was in Spokane though for 5 of the 7 days, right?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
That is
Yep.
wild. So, Bryan, I want to ask you, to put together something like this, you obviously have done your homework. How many pages of documents do you estimate you've been through, and how many hours of research? Kind of talk about some of those things as we kind of try and get a scope of like what it took to put on or to write this book.
Well, I would say that it took me about, I'd say 6 to 9 months of research and writing. I went through 2,500 pages of FBI documents. And even after that, they're like, you want some more? We have more. And I'm like, no, I think 2,500 pages is just fine. Thank you very much. And then also over 200 newspaper articles as well. It was, I have binders and binders of documents. It's crazy how much information is out there about this.
I want to ask, what do you hope your readers take away from this book?
I really hope that people come to the realization that there are still a lot of really awesome stories from around this area that people aren't even aware of. Some people are aware of the Weyerhaeuser kidnapping, but most people aren't. And those who do know about it have no clue how fascinating and how deep this story runs. There are a lot of great stories here in the Northwest. There's so many great stories, and I want people to keep digging and looking for them because they're out there.
Yeah, that's great. Well, is there, Nicole, do you have any questions?
A little bit about his history, like how long has he been here? We haven't talked about that already.
History been in Spokane?
Yeah.
Oh, you're in Seattle, right, Bryan?
Oh.
I'm in Seattle.
Gotcha. Anything else? Cool. Is there any, Bryan, is there any, the book is going to be released when? Tell us how people can get the book.
The book comes out on Tuesday, September 14th, and you can get it through Amazon, Barnes & Noble, any bookstore. And if you want it, depending on when your story's airing, if it's airing before Tuesday, you can pre-order it also through Amazon or through Barnes & Noble. It's called Deep in the Woods. Great story.